We received your message and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her.
If the payment is not received by the last deadline, she will be killed. Your mother is aware of this. Her life is in your hands. That line sat in a note for almost 6 months before anyone outside a small circle knew it existed. No name attached to it. No confirmation of who wrote it, or whether they meant a word of it. Just a threat sent to a grieving family and a deadline that came and went. This case is active and unresolved. Some of what you're about to hear is difficult, and some of it still doesn't add up, even to the people investigating it. Wherever you're watching this from, drop it in the comments. This case has reached almost every corner of the country at this point, and it's worth knowing how far the story has traveled. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived alone in the Catalina foothills, a quiet neighborhood just north of Tucson, Arizona. On the night of January 31st, she was dropped off at her home after spending the evening with family. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. The next morning, she was expected to join a virtual church service with a friend. She never logged on. When the friend couldn't reach her, they raised the alarm. Within hours, deputies were at her house, and within a day, investigators were treating it as a crime scene, not a wellness check. Her security camera at the front door had been disabled. For days, no one knew why or by whom. Then footage was recovered. It showed a masked figure at her door, dressed in a jacket, gloves, and a backpack, tampering with the camera before it went dark. Investigators found drops of blood near the front entrance. Later, DNA recovered from a glove found not far from the property was matched to DNA found inside her home. Nancy Guthrie was gone. Nothing about the scene suggested she'd left on her own. There was also a detail that made every hour afterward feel heavier. Nancy Guthrie relied on daily medication to manage a serious health condition. Whoever had taken her, if that's what happened, had also taken her away from whatever kept her stable. Investigators raised that publicly, early on, as part of the urgency behind the search. It wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was a clock, ticking on more than one level at once. Her disappearance made national news almost immediately, in part because of who her daughter is, a familiar face on morning television. But for the family, none of that mattered. What mattered was that an 84-year-old woman who needed daily medication was missing, and no one could say where she was. Within 48 hours, this was no longer just a local sheriff's case. The FBI's Phoenix field office joined the investigation, working alongside the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The county sheriff told reporters at an early press conference that once the crime scene had been processed, investigators were confident this was not a woman who had simply wandered off. Her limited mobility alone made that theory almost impossible. Days later, the FBI released the recovered doorbell footage publicly, along with a surveillance image of a person of interest. It was grainy. It showed a build, a posture, an outline, enough to work with, not enough to identify anyone. Tips poured in anyway, tens of thousands of them, eventually, from people certain they recognized something in that image, or certain they'd seen Nancy Guthrie somewhere she shouldn't have been. Some forensic experts who reviewed the public details of the scene raised a separate question entirely: whether everything about the scene was exactly what it appeared to be, or whether some of it had been arranged to look a certain way. It was one theory among many, and like almost everything else in this case, it went nowhere conclusive. 2 days after she vanished, a note arrived. It was sent to TMZ and to a Tucson television station addressed directly to her daughter. "Hello, Savannah. We have your mother, Nancy. She is safe but scared. She will be held for ransom, and once payment is received, she will be released unharmed. We will be holding her for a maximum of 7 days." The demand was $4 million, paid in Bitcoin, with a first deadline of 5 p.m. that Thursday. If that deadline passed, the price rose to $6 million, with a final deadline the following Monday. Once payment is received to the Bitcoin address below, she will be released within 12 hours of deposit to a safe drop-off location back in Tucson. Then came the line that would end up defining the entire case. If the payment is not received by the last deadline on Monday the 9th at 5 p.m., she will be killed. Your mother is aware of this, and her life is in your hands. It is in the best interest of everyone to have this completed as soon as possible. You will not be able to contact me from here on out. There will be no negotiation. Do not play games. Law enforcement will not be able to help you. What made investigators take the note seriously wasn't the threat. Threats are cheap. What caught their attention were two small, specific details buried near the end. The note mentioned a white smartwatch left on the floor near the foot of Nancy's bed, and it mentioned a floodlight in her backyard, destroyed. Neither detail had been made public. Whoever wrote that note either knew something only someone inside that house could know, or had been fed the information by someone who did. The deadlines came, both of them. No confirmed payment was made. No release followed. There was something else notable about the note, easy to miss on a first read. It demanded the ransom specifically in US dollars worth of Bitcoin, and it addressed Savannah Guthrie by name, not just as a relative, but as the person the sender clearly expected to be able to pay. To investigators, that suggested deliberate targeting. Whoever sent it knew exactly which member of this family had the means to meet a 7-figure demand, and structured the entire note around her specifically. For the family, the note created an impossible position. Law enforcement, as a rule, discourages ransom payments to unverified senders. There was no proof of life attached to the note, no photograph, no recording, nothing beyond a smartwatch and a broken floodlight to suggest the sender had ever actually been inside that house. And yet the alternative to trusting it was worse to consider. Days later, a second note arrived at the same Tucson television station. The tone had changed completely. We did not fully grasp the seriousness of her physical conditions. We never intended to hurt her. That was not our intention. She perished shortly after she was taken. We believe it was heart-related. She is buried in nature now. Nothing you could have done could have changed the outcome. We are truly sorry. No more demands. No more countdown. Just a claim that she was already gone, and an apology that read almost like a confession. Investigators studying the phrasing noticed something else. Certain word choices and sentence structures didn't sound like a native English speaker. Some wondered whether the note had been run through a translation tool. It was a small detail, but in a case built almost entirely on paper evidence, small details were all anyone had. Savannah Guthrie and her siblings responded publicly in a video addressed directly to whoever had sent it. "We received your message, and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. This is very valuable to us, and we will pay." It was an extraordinary thing to watch. a family on camera negotiating with someone who claimed, in writing, that their mother was already dead. Some who studied the second note closely came away with a different read entirely. To them, the language sounded less like a kidnapper covering their tracks, and more like someone delivering unbearable news as gently as they knew how. A confession dressed as an apology. Others weren't convinced the two notes had even come from the same source. The first was cold, transactional, built entirely around a deadline. The second read almost remorseful. It's rare for the same person to write both of those in the space of a few days. Whichever read was correct, one fact didn't change. Nancy Guthrie had not been found. Dead or alive, buried in nature, or somewhere else entirely, there was still no body, no confirmed location, nothing beyond a note's word for any of it. After the second note, the case entered a strange stretch. No new messages, no new footage, just a family waiting and a reward growing larger by the week, as if a bigger number might finally be the thing that shook something loose. The family put up a private reward of $1 million for information leading directly to Nancy's return. The FBI added its own reward on top of that. A separate crime tip organization added more still. Altogether, the total climbed past $1 million, then kept climbing until it sat somewhere north of 1.2 million. For scale, that's more than 17 times what a single Bitcoin was worth at the time the later notes were demanding it, and still nothing. Investigators kept working leads privately, the way they tend to when a case goes quiet publicly. Somewhere behind the scenes, tens of thousands of tips were being logged, sorted, and either dismissed or chased down one by one. None of it reached the public in a way that moved the case forward. For months, all anyone outside the investigation actually knew for certain was that a woman was still missing, and that two notes existed, and that neither of them had led anywhere. For weeks after that, the case went quiet in terms of new developments. Then, months later, on the same day Savannah Guthrie returned to television for the first time since her mother's disappearance, new messages arrived. This time, they went to TMZ. The sender claimed to have information about who took Nancy Guthrie and offered to hand it over for 1 Bitcoin. Then came a second message from the same source, this one naming a place for the first time in the entire case. I saw her alive with them in the state of Sonora, Mexico. It was the first time any note had pointed to a specific location. The sender claimed to have been out of the country for years, insisted they had nothing to do with the abduction, and lashed out at investigators for what they called being dismissed as a scam. Investigators were far more cautious about this round of messages than the first two. There was no equivalent to the smartwatch or the floodlight, no detail that only an insider could know, just a claim, a location, and a price. Experts who reviewed it publicly treated it as most likely opportunistic, someone chasing a reward that, by that point, had grown past $1 million between the family, the FBI, and a private tip line. This wasn't even the sender's first message. Weeks earlier, the same source had emailed a claim that they'd seen Nancy south of the border, and that they knew who was responsible but had been warned to stay quiet. Each new email raised the price, and each one added a little more detail, the way a story tends to grow the longer someone has to keep telling it. By the time the Sonora message arrived, the sender was asking for payment in 2 installments, half before sharing information, half only after an arrest was made public. One retired law enforcement figure, reviewing the pattern publicly, pointed to something worth sitting with. A grassroots search group from Sonora, made up of mothers who look for missing people across that stretch of Mexico, had reportedly begun quietly looking for Nancy Guthrie there too, independent of anything in the notes. Whether that was a coincidence or whether it meant the notes had reached people outside the investigation entirely was never resolved either. Here is where the case stops making sense in a straight line. For months, the working assumption, reported publicly and echoed by Savannah Guthrie herself in an interview, was that at least the first two notes might be genuine. She said so directly, on television, in her own words, that most of the notes she'd seen reported on were fake, but that the two her family had personally responded to, she tended to believe were real. Then, more recently, that assumption was directly contradicted. Multiple FBI officials, speaking to reporters, said the Bureau's current position is that none of the ransom notes in this case are believed to be genuine. Investigators reportedly went as far as sending a small test payment to the Bitcoin address listed in the first note to check whether it was even active. So, which is it? Were the smartwatch and the floodlight proof that someone inside that house wrote those words? Or were they details that could have leaked, been guessed, or been passed along by someone with no real connection to what happened to Nancy Guthrie at all? As of now, there's no public answer. The FBI hasn't laid out in detail why its position changed, or what changed it. The family has not walked back what Savannah Guthrie said on camera. Two positions exist at the same time, from two credible sources, and they cannot both be fully true. No arrest has been made. No suspect has been named. The masked figure on that doorbell camera has never been identified. It's worth sitting with how strange that is. This isn't a case where the evidence dried up and the notes were all anyone had left to go on. There's footage. There's DNA. There's a physical crime scene that was processed within a day of the disappearance being reported. And after nearly 6 months of forensic work, the piece of the case getting the most public attention right now is still 2 pieces of paper, and whether or not to believe them. Some true crime cases resolve because one detail cracks everything open. A traffic camera, a confession to a cellmate, a financial trail that doesn't add up. Nothing like that has surfaced here, at least not publicly. What surfaced instead is a credibility problem, layered on top of a missing person, on top of a family that has had to grieve, hope, and doubt, sometimes all in the same week. It's easy in a case like this to get lost in the notes, the deadlines, the Bitcoin addresses, the contradictions. But before any of that, Nancy Guthrie was a mother of 4, a grandmother, someone who spent her last confirmed evening with family before going home for the night. She needed daily medication. She logged onto a virtual church service most mornings. She lived a quiet life in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of life that doesn't make the news, until suddenly it does. Her daughter has spent months in front of cameras she doesn't control, pleading for information, wiping away tears on live television, negotiating in public with someone who may or may not have ever had her mother at all. At one point, addressing viewers directly, she said this wasn't just a story on their radar for a news cycle. It's the life her family now lives every single day, without pause, without an off switch. She said, more than once, that she doesn't want the conversation to center on theories or suspects. She wants it to center on the fact that somebody, somewhere, knows something. A neighbor who noticed a car. A pawn shop that took in something it shouldn't have. A person who has stayed quiet for 6 months because they assumed someone else would come forward first. Nearly 6 months later, there is still no confirmed answer to the only question that actually matters. Where is Nancy Guthrie? What makes this case different from most isn't just the notes, or the reward, or even the fame attached to it. It's the sheer amount of it that's played out in public. Most missing person cases develop quietly, behind closed doors, with families given the privacy to process each update away from cameras. This one hasn't had that luxury. Every note leak, every contradiction, every shift in the FBI's public position has arrived as a headline, sometimes before the family itself has had time to absorb it. That's part of why getting the details right matters here more than in most cases. It's easy for a story like this to calcify around whichever version got the most attention first, true or not. The smartwatch and the floodlight were real and reported early, precisely because they were the kind of details a family desperately wants to be true. Proof, however small, that whoever sent that note had actually seen her, actually knew she was somewhere. Whether that hope was well placed is still, 6 months on, an open question. This case remains open. If you have any information, contact the FBI or your local authorities. If you or someone you know is affected by a missing persons case, support resources are available, and you don't have to navigate it alone. Please subscribe to this channel for more cases like this one.